Good afternoon. Happy Friday. Welcome to CoMotion Labs Fundamentals for Startups. I'm Yuli Rivera, CoMotion Labs Life Sciences Manager. If you've joined us before, you know that CoMotion Labs is the University of Washington's efforts around startup incubation. We operate 3 incubators here on campus: hardware, life science, and a software tech incubator called Startup Hall, where we have a wonderful partnership with BECU, which you will hear more about shortly. We don't take equity in our startups. We don't take any of your IP. We just want to help startups succeed. So if you are a founder looking for somewhere to work, let's talk. If you're a fintech founder or thinking about launching a fintech startup, we just opened applications for our next cohort of startups to our fintech accelerator with BECU. It's a great program, and cohort companies are able to interface consistently with all the good people at BECU and get exposure to how things are done at a large credit union. It's an awesome program and well worth applying to. While we wait for everyone to join us, I'll make a few announcements. Next week, Jane Park, CEO and founder of Talkie, will present Failing into Entrepreneurship. This is a reminder that all of our Fundamentals for Startup presentations are archived on our CoMotion website under Innovation Training Videos. We have covered a variety of topics over the past several years, so if you find yourself with some free time, check out our past talks. For our full schedule and to register for our future fundamentals, please visit the Fundamentals for Startups page on our website. Also, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and click the notification bell to be notified of all future live streams. Fundamentals for Startups is funded in part by a grant from the Economic Development Agency. We'll be dropping a link into the chat for a short survey. Please tell us who you are, where you're watching from, and how you heard about this event. This will help us report back to continue the funding. This month, we are proud to partner with BECU to support the Fundamentals for Startups program. In a little bit, Doug Marshall, Executive Vice President and Chief Product and Digital Officer at BECU, will join us. But first, see how BECU, Washington's largest not-for-profit credit union, is helping grow the fintech community and inspire innovation in the Pacific Northwest.
Hello, everyone, and welcome again to this series session today. Again, I'm Doug Marshall, the Digital and Product Officer at BECU. We're really pleased to be a part of the event today. And as you heard and have seen, BECU is a financial services cooperative, those of you that don't know us, whose purpose is to improve the financial well-being of the members and the communities that we live in. And of course, emerging technology is a critical tool to help do that. Whether that's a loan, in fact, we've deployed over 8 products and services in the last 12 months to do that very thing, or in partnership with organizations like the ones that are in this CoMotion partnership. It's a very, very vital partnership for us. So we're pleased to be here today. We've partnered with CoMotion over the last 3 years to support the growth of the fintech community, initially in Puget Sound, and in fact now beyond Puget Sound. And in that time, we've supported over 11 fintech startups through the incubator. And we've offered grants through the fintech track of the Innovation Gap Fund. And through that, we've learned a lot about how to work differently, think differently, move things to market more quickly. And we've heard consistently that the participants have benefited as well. So With that in mind, as Julie mentioned, if you'd like to be a part of the next cohort, please visit the site. You'll see over there in the chat, and we can drop the link in there as well. This month, we're really proud to have contributed to this entire series, but particularly pleased to be a part of today's event where Matt Oppenheimer, the CEO of Remitly and a BECU board member, is going to take you through some really important information around customer centricity. With that, I will just share this. Matt is the co-founder of Remitly, all the way back in 2011. And he serves today as Chief Executive Officer, as I mentioned, and a board of the directors of Remitly. Matt, prior to that, was at Barclays for a couple of years. And then today, as I alluded to, serves on the BECU board of directors as well. And we're pleased about that partnership. Matt has a number of recognitions and awards, including the EY Entrepreneur of the Year award. He was named one of the Puget Sound Business Journal's 40 under 40 recipients and a number of other designations, as I mentioned. Matt holds an undergraduate degree from Dartmouth and an MBA from Harvard, and will also, as he moves into this, be taking questions from chat. So if you have a question, throw that in the chat, and we'll move into this. I know Matt has a lot of passion around customers, or in our case, members, so I'm really looking forward to seeing what he has to say today. So with that, Matt, over to you.
Thanks so much, Doug, for the very, very kind introduction. Thanks everybody for joining, and thanks to CoMotion for having me. So as Doug said, you can put questions in the chat throughout the presentation. I'm going to go through a few slides, but I'm going to pause in between various sections just so we have time to engage in chat. So please do think of the questions. And the sections I'm going to go through are just start with an overview of who Remitly is, what we've done, a bit on the founder story and background. Then the second is going to be around culture, defining what culture is, how I think about culture. I think it's an often used term,
Yes,
but
I can.
Oh, can you hear me okay or no? Yeah, okay, keep going. And then the third is how we've instilled culture at Remitly, and specifically talking about customer centricity as evidenced by the talk. That being the cornerstone, I think, of any culture that is serving customers. So with that, we'll go ahead and jump in. I'm going to start, as I said, with a little bit of background on Remitly. And everything at Remitly ties to our vision, which is to transform the lives of immigrants and their families by providing the most trusted financial services on the planet. And we talk about this a lot internally, a lot externally. Ultimately, it's very mission driven to the transform the lives point. For immigrants who are our primary customers and their families, the recipients. And then by providing the most trusted, one thing I've learned over the last 10 years of building this business is how paramount is trust. People, or how trust is paramount before anything else. And our customers send a big percentage of their hard-earned money home. They provide us with information that they need to in order for us to be able to verify their identity and keep their funds safe. And then they're sending it thousands of miles away, oftentimes to be picked up in cash. And so trust is paramount, but hard to deliver in a very complex remittance business. And then financial services on the planet. When you think about primarily what we do is remittances, but we have a wide range of financial services that we want to deliver over time across the globe. So everything we do comes back to this vision. And I'll talk a little bit about where the business is at now. But before I do that, I thought for a lot of viewers who might be earlier in their entrepreneurial journey, that just talking a little bit about the founder and origin story. So I, for background, am fifth generation Idahoan, grew up in Boise, Idaho. Went to Dartmouth undergrad, as Doug mentioned. Then I did investment consulting for a company called Cambridge Associates. And most of my clients were endowed nonprofits, large foundations. So even though my day job was asset allocation, manager selection, there was a theme of having work that actually makes an impact. And I felt that there every day. I then went to Harvard for my MBA. And after that, joined Barclays Bank, and originally in London, in their corporate bank. And then I was in retail banking, specifically digital, so mobile and e-commerce for Barclays Bank Kenya, based out of Nairobi, Kenya. And I joined Barclays for the international experience, for the global experience. During my time in Kenya is where the idea for the business came from. And I saw how hard it was for me to send money internationally. I was getting paid in British pounds. I was living in Kenyan shillings. I eventually had to get money back to US dollars. That was painful, expensive. But it was even more important and more painful for a lot of my Kenyan friends to receive money from their loved ones internationally. And so that combined with the fact that M-Pesa was transforming domestic financial services felt like the right time to really transform how first remittances and then broader financial services are done for immigrants. And even though I'm from Idaho, I've traveled to close to 100 countries, lived and worked on 3 continents. And it's a super, super, super meaningful problem. Because when you look at, global challenges that we have, inequity, other challenges, and you look at the sacrifices that our customers make to move, again, very far from their families and loved ones, in order to build a better life for themselves and a better life for their loved ones back home. Remittances go an incredibly long way, and I'll talk about this later. But $1.5 trillion is sent every year in remittances, and if we can do that fundamentally better, if we can build more peace of mind with customers, and if we can really offer them a wide range of financial services over time, that makes a very positive impact on the world. So if you were to walk the virtual or in-person Remitly halls, I think you would see a team that is very dedicated to our mission. And we're very much on a mission focused on that long-term vision that I mentioned. If you look at how remittances are sent today, it's largely offline, brick and mortar, cash-based. And that's how, things like payments, there's a habitual component of it. People do it because they found a trusted way and they continue to do it again and again. Obviously, by providing a digital alternative for folks to get money home is something that I think is an inevitability. But with COVID and the pandemic, it was already starting to shift. That accelerated the shift. And once people use a digital device to send money back home for the first time, and specifically Remitly, and they have a good experience, we find that they send home money very, very regularly. But transforming this brick and mortar kind of broken system into a digital first system that builds true peace of mind to customers is ultimately what we're all about. We're 10 years into the journey, and our journey to get here, I think, is also, will tie back to some of the comments I'll make, obviously, as I go deeper on culture and customer centricity. But we took, I think, a very unique customer-centric approach in the early days. So 10 years into the journey, but if you kind of rewind, the first 2 years, all we did was focus on not only remittances, but just remittances from the US and really Washington State. We started just in Washington State with a money transmission license there to the Philippines. Then we spent about a year adding India, US to India, only US to India. Then we spent about a year adding US to Mexico. As I'll get to in a minute, we now serve over 1,700 corridors across the globe. But those early days, especially in a complex business like remittances, we did not get distracted by having to go too broad, too fast. We focused on really getting to know our customers in the Philippines, really building out the right risk systems, the right compliance systems, the right partners that we could send, that we could disperse money through in the Philippines. I spent a lot of time directly in the Philippines those days. All of the elements that are complex to get a remittance business going, we focused on just in the US and Philippines. That may sound obvious, but if you look at the trajectory of some other remittance companies, they went very broad. I think didn't get to know their customers as well. And by the way, one thing I say a lot within remittances is remittances are global, but customers are very much local. And so we didn't get some of that early organic growth. In a lot of ways, it was actually much harder to raise things like venture capital in those early days, because we needed to answer the question and prove, can you do this in the next country, in the next country, in the next country? Because 4 or 5 years into the business, we were still just in a handful of corridors. Corridors meaning country A to country B. So I think that customer-centric approach from the very early days, not getting distracted by what would drive short-term growth, but really focus on what would be in the long-term best interest of our customer and obviously therefore our business, has been key to our success. So fast forward 10 years later, we're now across 1,700 corridors, 135 countries, and we're starting to expand to broader financial services for immigrants. As I'll talk about in a minute, we're just getting started. So you can see here just a map of where we send money from and to. 1,800 corridors, 2.6 million active customers, $14.5 billion in send volume, 3.6 billion bank accounts, and 380,000 cash pickup locations. Yet we're only about 3% of the SAM, serviceable addressable market, and that's remittances just going from going to low and middle income countries. And we're 1% of that $1.5 trillion that I mentioned that is cross-border remittances worldwide. So an enormous amount of room to grow, an enormous amount of room to serve more customers. And we're excited about the continued opportunity to most importantly serve customers. So with that, let me pause before I start jumping into a little bit more depth on culture. And happy to take any questions from the chat. Happy to talk more about the business, about the early days of the business. If some of the folks on the call are thinking about or in the early days of being in their entrepreneurial journey, can share lessons learned there. But I'll pause and open it up for chat. I think there's a bit of a delay, so just give folks a minute to ask any questions. And then after that, we'll jump into culture.
Matt, in the early days, how many times did you pivot the product before it resonated with your customers?
Yeah, thanks. Good question, Julian. Thanks for capturing it. So whenever I think about, like, a lot of folks have asked me, how'd you get the idea for Remitly? I talked about the idea in terms of where we've gone to solve a problem, but it's really, really important. And I heard this from a Techstars mentor, and I should really look at who that mentor was and find his name so I give him appropriate credit. But we were part of Techstars 2011. And what he basically said was, find a problem that really frustrates you, that you want to dedicate, a good portion of your life to solving, and fall in love with that problem, but do not fall in love with the solution. And so for me, the problem that I stated, which was not the solution, it was the problem, was sending money internationally was expensive, inconvenient, painful. But we had a lot of pivots, Yuli, going back to your question, Yuli, along the way. So I initially thought, let's do a search engine for remittances, kind of like the kayak for remittances, because you don't have to build out all the infrastructure that I mentioned to be able to send money internationally. I learned very, very early, mainly by talking with other companies that had failed in the space, that was not a model that was really going to transform remittances. I then thought that, if coming from Kenya, that everybody around the globe would want money into like an M-Pesa mobile wallet. And so one of our first disbursement partners in the Philippines was a mobile wallet. And that was like the pitch early days, was mobile phone to mobile wallet. Spent some time in the Philippines, December of 2011, and learned very quickly that people wanted cash pickup. They want instant bank deposit. They want mobile wallets too, but just that option was not a suitable solution for customers overall. But we had pitched, like, that was the positioning. And I think most investors understand early days that pivoting and adjusting is super important, and they're betting on a team that can actually make the right judgment calls, find the right hypotheses in an organized way. This is something that Chris DeVore from Founders Co-op often tells us that we did well. And when I say we, much more was my co-founder and Josh that did this, and Shabazz than I. But we had a very structured approach to, like, we're trying to solve this problem. Here are all the hypotheses that we can have that are inherent in our potential solution. And sometimes before building product, it was talking to competitors and why they had failed. Sometimes it was testing the hypothesis pre-product. Sometimes it was building product, but getting a real, like, read on it as early as possible and as efficiently as possible, so that we eventually came up with the product that we have now in the remittance space, which is still originating from a mobile phone, any digital device, but primarily mobile phones, to a wide range of disbursement options across the globe. So lots of early pivots along the way. And that's ultimately what got us to the solution of the problem that we were very, very passionate about and continue to be very passionate about. Awesome. Any other questions in this section? Give it a few seconds before we jump into culture.
You mentioned that in the early days, you focused on one country at a time, really figured out, the problems and how to really get a hold there. Did anyone challenge your decision to focus so narrowly for so long? For like a country for an entire year?
Yeah, definitely. And I think so I had a lot of conviction it was the right decision. And I drew inspiration from how Amazon focused not only in e-commerce, but as a bookseller. People forget. Started as a bookseller, expanded within e-commerce, expanded to a wide range of things over time in a very large market that in some ways, like e-commerce, is kind of like obvious that it should be disrupted, just like remittances. But it's hard and very operationally complex to do. So I had conviction it was the right strategy, but to your question, there definitely were primarily investors, I would say, because there are always risks to any investment. And I think that some of our other remittance companies at the time, even, they were growing faster. And investors for early stage companies, like that early growth and traction, can be compelling. We have had a really steady growth rate for a lot of years because we've been so intentional about our growth. But we had to really be able to answer. It was really, really hard to answer, like, can you be successful in Mexico? Because, when we were raising that round, maybe we had just launched Mexico or just launched India. We didn't have the data to prove it. We hadn't been enough corridors to say that we could repeat it because it was only our second or third. And those were some tough times from a capital raising perspective. And you always see the headlines, but those early fundraisers were challenging. No doubt it was the right long-term strategy, though. And I think that that's how we've been able to kind of continue to sustain our growth rate. And it ties to the title of this talk in a very customer-centric way, with the principle that customers, or remittances, are global, customers are very much local.
Great. And before we move on from the early days, and there's a question that comes up a lot with startup journeys. Can you expand it upon like the biggest lessons learned from the early days?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's all about culture and team, which we'll get to at any stage of the company. It's all about having a growth mindset and asking and receiving feedback with a growth mindset. And on that one, I think the thing that I think a lot of folks don't realize is investors, if they pass, they don't want to give you, they're not super incentivized to give you feedback if they pass on an investment. Because they want to stay in touch. They don't want to offend you. And customers, like, this is why oftentimes like the whole Eric Riesling startup approach is good, because customers, it's hard to get feedback from too. Putting a product in front of them in a lean way and seeing what they do and react to it will give you very definitive feedback. But in addition to that, like actual data read from customers, I just think having a growth mindset is super important, so that when you ask an investor, if you have an open mind, if you want to hear their feedback, you don't have to agree with it, but you're trying to understand their perspective. I think you'll get more feedback along the way, and that will help you iterate and improve when you've got limited amount of runway capital time in those early days. So really inviting feedback with a growth mindset is the second thing. I think that the third I talked about, fall in love with a problem, not a solution, ties to growth mindset, but pivot. Those are some of the hardest calls that entrepreneurs have to make, but like pivoting at the right time, knowing when to pivot, being open to pivot to solve the problem and not being in love with the solution, super important. Those are three things that come to mind immediately. Awesome. Any others before we jump into culture?
I think that's all we have for now.
Awesome. All right. Let's jump in to the fun stuff. All this is fun, but I especially like culture. So let me talk a little bit about, actually, before we jump into a little bit about Remitly's culture. So what is culture, right? Because I think it's a word that's used a lot. For me, it's how people interact, it's how people get things done. And every company is different in this way. It's fascinating. Like, I'm sure a lot of folks on this video have worked at several places, and you join a new organization, you just get a sense that like each organization is very different. And so I think some companies grow in an intentional way related to their culture, and some are less intentional, but every company has a unique culture, and it's how people interact and it's how people get things done. I think there are some companies, in my view, that have been more intentional about scaling a culture. And I don't mention any company that I'm about to in a way that like has a judgment around whether their culture is good or bad, but just in that they've been intentional about how to build their culture. Amazon is one that comes to mind first, that they call their equivalent of our cultural values would be their leadership principles. I'll come back to that later, but I think that how they define their leadership principles and integrate them into the interview process, performance review process, all of that is a great example. And there's a whole litany of other examples I could go through, but the point is some companies are intentional and some I think are less. I've learned a ton about culture from people that I really respect over the years. Nigel Morris, the founder of Capital One Bank, is one person that comes to mind. I've learned an enormous amount from him over the years on how to define a culture and build a culture. But defining it's the first step. And both defining what we mean by the word culture, which is how people interact and how things get things done, how people get things done. And then also importantly, then defining then that for each individual company. For us, you can see our values here. And they are in no particular order except customer centricity. We put them in buckets around purpose, action, relationships, but if you were to walk the halls of Remitly, you would hear those words less, and you would hear more the sub-bullets under those: joyful, aim for the stars, don't be afraid to fail, be an owner, etc. I won't read through all of them here. And similar to Amazon's leadership principles in construct, not in content, because you've noticed some clear differences, obviously. But in construct, it's a longer list. And I tend to think that when companies go about to define culture, that they can oftentimes be led by the objective of make it short, memorable, and if it's not short and memorable, then it's boiling the ocean. I personally disagree with that because I think human interaction is more complex than like 5 catchy words. I don't think culture should ever, that cultural values, because of the complexity of human interaction, no employee at Remitly should be like quizzed on what are our cultural values. I don't think they need to be memorable. I think that they take a lot more reflection and deep reflection. And I learned that over the last 10 years because from the early days, we knew that culture was going to be important. We knew we wanted to build something lasting and global and big. And in order to do that, we had to get culture right. So like 3 months into the business, the 3 co-founders, Josh, Shavas, and I, all went and did a little mini offsite. And at that offsite, we whiteboarded what we wanted Remitly's culture to be. And we had some words on there, like relationships, as an example. Customer centricity was there. It will always be there. It'll always be number one. And that one has not evolved. But others have evolved, and I think they've gotten much better. And they weren't just this one catchy word like relationships. And the way I test is it a good value is, can I objectively actually discuss it with someone on whether or not they're strong at it or whether or not there are areas of improvement? And take relationships as an example. That has evolved. And we refresh our values periodically, more refreshes towards the beginning of the company, but still refreshes now. A year or 2 ago was our last refresh. We took some off. We added lead authentically and joyful. And if you were to go to our publicly facing site and just if you Google like Remitly culture, you'd also see the definition of each of these cultural values. And each one of those words, the definitions is very carefully selected, and we refresh those as part of the refresh as well. So we had relationships beginning, like I said, catchy, memorable. I'm sure a lot of companies have relationships as a value. I think it's more objective, clear, easier to discuss if you break it out into component parts. And you can see the 4 here, but all 4 of those I think are key in terms of relationships. But to put a couple in action, I think it's, instead of saying, hey, you're really good at relationships or you need to work on relationships, I think it's much easier to say, you know what, I feel like when we were working on this project last week, that in the meeting, the tone, the approach, it didn't feel like you were an empathetic partner with me. And I'd really appreciate some more empathy as we interact, because here's where I'm coming from. Or on a celebratory stance, you know what, I just really appreciate you being constructively direct with me and telling me exactly how you feel, because it helped me learn from your perspective. Those are the kind of things that build relationships. But I think that these subcomponents are what we focus on at Remitly. And I think that they're super important to be clear and more detailed, again, because human interaction is complex. So once culture is defined, then how do you actually integrate that into an organization? And I kind of call it the bookends and then everything in between. And the bookends is then integrating them in a very intentional way into the interview process and integrating them in a very intentional way into the performance review process. So in our interview process, Remitly interviewers are not only interviewing based on the skills required for that role, and each interviewer will have certainly a skill or two or three that they'll each be focused on during an interview with Remitly, but also a cultural value or two that they'll be each going deeper into and asking the right questions to assess. Not only, I don't like cultural fit, I think it's cultural add. We want folks that are even better at some of these values than we currently are, can push us, but we're asking around those questions to see if they are aligned in principle with how we interact at Remitly. And then again, at performance review, it's not just about what is accomplished, it's about how those results were achieved. And I'm sure everybody on this call to some extent has worked with individuals who only focus on outputs and leave a lot of damage along the way. And that, if it's integrated intentionally into the performance review process, I think can prevent that. So the couple other things I'll mention around culture and our cultural values is I don't believe that they should be like this chest thumping, everyone is amazing at all of these things, including myself. They should be a North Star. And again, with the growth mindset, a North Star to be able to reflect on, here is where I excel, here's some of my strengths, here are areas where I need to grow and continuously improve is one of our values. And that's the way that I view culture, because it's inauthentic to say, here's Remitly's culture and everybody at Remitly is amazing at every one of these things, including the CEO. I think there are growth areas for all of us, but having a North Star, I think, gives us the ability to try to achieve that North Star because they are clearly defined. I think the second is there's sometimes tension between some of the values, and that's intentional. So aim for the stars and don't be afraid to fail. Constructively direct and be an empathetic partner. Those are just a couple pairings where balance is important, and sometimes there'll be skewing of individuals on one side or the other in those, but you can talk about it openly. You can reflect as an individual on where there are opportunities to grow, and there's, again, a commonly held like verbiage to be able to talk about those things in a more objective way. So the tension is also, I think, intentional. The tension is intentional. I could also, by the way, write a compendium on all of the things that I feel about culture, and so maybe I'll do that someday. But in the meantime, it's fun to go through and reflect on some of the things that we've been able to do, both on defining it and then the bookends. But then there's everything in between, and I think that what we've done there is, I think, learn from our global teams. We have, most of our teams are outside of the U.S. If you look at our global team, and how, especially pre-COVID when I could travel and visit the sites, but even now when I do virtual site visits, there is the ability to really learn about how everyone from our customer support sites to our engineering teams in Krakow to our team in London to our team in Seattle, there's so many creative ideas about how culture is actually implemented. And that's been super fulfilling, interesting, wonderful. It's made us better as a global company. And and we've tried to take the best ideas around the globe and kind of roll them out across the globe in sometimes slightly different ways, but in ways that are authentic and kind of growing and learning from each other, as opposed to culture being pushed down from some centralized team. So I'm going to pause there before we jump into customer centricity in more detail. And as I pause, I'm going to go off video for 1 second so I can close my blinds and not be blinded and you all can see me. And Yuli, feel free to give it a second, and then we'll jump into the first question on this section.
Thanks, Matt. I think tying in with this part about values and culture, how do you maintain a high bar with the culture when you are hiring rapidly? I think you're still on mute, Matt.
Thanks. It's got to happen once. I think that first, I think for folks that are earlier in their startup journey, the reason that defining culture is so important, I think back to those decisions of our fourth team member. And it was when I said team and culture, what it's all about in the early days, it's 25% of our team. I think about a decision now where I'm this one decision is going to be 25% of our team. Whew, it's a big decision. It's a big decision. You can't be slow in decisions for a startup. So I'm not saying, whew, don't make the decision. But I think that first, again, having just regardless of your size, if there are 3 of you in the room, sit down and say, what kind of culture do we want to create, even if it's imperfect? And don't boil the ocean, but having something's better than nothing. And the conversation is equally as important as the result. And then I think in terms of hiring, like I said, integrate that into the hiring process as part of the discussion of defining culture. Start to talk about what kind of questions you would ask, such that you can actually assess that. Ask the same questions to multiple candidates so you can calibrate. And then, if you're slightly larger, I think that you can start to get a sense of who are great interviewers and have them on those interview loops, whether it's like an official like bar raiser kind of approach or whether it's more informal, making sure you have, it's just a skill. It's a skill like engineering. And some people are just very good interviewers, and making sure they're on the loops. If you're a startup and you're calibrating both on skills assessment or cultural assessment, I would also think about some of the early hires we made. I'd have somebody on the interview loop that wasn't even part of the company, just to give a unique perspective on a certain topic or because I thought they were a great interviewer. So I think just a lot of, and then the last thing I'll say is having just an intentional process for the interview debrief. We, from the very first days, required everybody to write up their thoughts with clear examples, try to remove bias from the interviews, also trying to remove bias or seniority influence from the debrief. We require still, but even in the early days, before going into the debrief, everybody had to come into that debrief with a decision, and we had it on a gradient so that whoever speaks first isn't biasing the rest of the group. And so there's rigor going into that interview process of actually preparation to be able to back up that decision with the why. So those are some principles, practices. Some of them are probably obvious. Some of them might be unique, but it's all about team and culture. And if you're hiring your 4th team member right now, like, don't slow down because you don't have time, obviously, to start up, but I think be intentional.
Right. You mentioned just revisiting your values, your culture, more of a refresh. And building a culture in the beginning isn't easy, but arguably changing a culture can be harder. What advice do you have for people working to change a culture?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's so circumstantial. I think that if it's a startup, it's probably more being created than changed. But if you've got someone on the team that you feel like does not culturally align with everybody else, then addressing that, talking about it, acting on that. If it's a larger company, and I think it's so situational that whether or not it's a kind of wayward culture, and therefore there needs to just be a better definition of it, or whether it's more of like a turnaround situation where like setting clear values that are different than what currently exists is most important. And I do think culture to some extent should follow business strategy and what the business does. I think every company should be somewhat mission driven, but ours is like deep to the core, given the customers we serve. Customer centricity has always been at the top. A lot of our values, when I say it should tie to business strategy, like it's an operationally complex business in remittances. So data driven, sweat the details, bias for action, a lot of the relationship elements, tie to how you effectively operate a business. And then obviously the purpose front. Anyway, I think that it should tie to business strategy, but how to change a culture, I think those are some tools. It's so circumstantial. And I think the other thing I'd say is it takes time. It takes a lot of time to build a culture or to change a culture. And so even changing a culture, being patient and having a plan and reinforcing it and being intentional, but it's not going to change overnight. Which is why you don't want to get too large before you start to instill a culture, because if you've kind of got a wayward culture and then you start to implement one, I think it just takes time to implement as opposed to being able to build and continuously improve on a culture that already exists.
Right. And for your unifying values, these 3 buckets, have any of these bullets been part of your values and culture since day one?
Customer centricity, yep, for sure. Act with integrity. I think it was just integrity first, but we made it a little more like actionable, as most of these are. I'd have to go back. There are probably a couple others, but the vast majority have either been refined or added. be an owner might have been there from the start. And be an owner is like being an owner of the business, not of your function or of your area. That one's often misunderstood. And so the definition of that one's super clear, but that one I think has been there from the start. Something we wanted to instill as we grew as founders. So, but yeah, it's been a lot of like new ones along the way, 10 years in. If you were to look 3, 4, 5 years back, it would be more similar. And we did at that offsite take some like photos of the of what we whiteboarded. So we still have that original customer centricity photo. I remember seeing integrity on there because I looked at them relatively recently, but I should go back and look at all of them to do a more like detailed comparison.
Great. I think we have a hodgepodge of random questions, and I'll capture that at the end here.
All right, perfect. Yes. Why don't we go through a bit on customer centricity, and then we'll open it up for any other questions on folks' minds. So customer centricity, I think that, like I've said a few times, central to all of our values, always at the top, customer centricity. And I think that winning companies tie decisions that they make and everything they do back to what is in the best long-term interest of their customers. Not every company, like there's a few asterisks, which I won't name, but I think most companies that are successful, especially in the long term, have to have that as a principle. Customers could be businesses, they could be consumers, you name it, but that's number one. And I think that if you look at how customer centricity has been embedded into our culture, it started with our business strategy around a single corridor and got that right before expanding. And as I think about that as well, we also really got to know our customers in an authentic way, not in a way that was transactional, not in a way that was surface level. Our very first customer, as an example, was at my wedding. One of our and from the Philippines, his family. Another example is I joined the Filipino Chamber of Commerce in the Pacific Northwest in the early days, and didn't like join and start asking a bunch of questions about remittances and products. I joined and contributed as a member. One of the former leaders of the chamber like joined Remitly as an advisor, and became part of the company in that way. And in those early days, we tried to do like, there's a Brian Chesky quote in the Masters at Scale podcast, which has always stuck with me. He said it better than I did. We did what he said, but then I heard him say it later and I was like, that makes sense. We tried to do marketing channels. We rolled out marketing channels that did not scale. Like, I think that is something that helped us get closer to customers and live our customer centricity value. I wish I could pull up the photo. I don't have it handy, but there's this photo. What we did, one of the things we did when I say marketing channels that don't scale, is we rented the like South Center Mall, the mall in South Seattle. There's a Seafood City grocery store where some of the Filipino community shops, and then there's remittance centers for the Philippines specifically in that grocery store, and there's like a Jollibee restaurant which is popular in the Philippines, but there's one here in Seattle. So we set up that like kiosk in the mall right outside of the store. And what's an online international money transmitter doing, like setting up that kiosk? We didn't want to like scale. We just wanted to interact and get to know customers. And we staffed it with the advisor that I mentioned that was part of the chamber. We really got to know our customers and got great feedback. To that growth mindset point, it is super, but we just were open to feedback. And it was hard to get feedback at times because our product like was not very good. We were just sending to a mobile wallet and not many people at the time use that mobile wallet. But that's how we pivoted and iterated fast enough before you kind of run out of runway capital time, which is ultimately why a lot of startups don't succeed. So that's another way in those early days around customer centricity. I think that we still, now that even though we're across 2,000 corridors, we try to instill and give the tools of that same customer centricity for the team across the globe. And it comes in different forms, right? At our stage versus those early days that I talked about. But we obviously have an insights team. We have a customer empathy team. We do something called Customer Day on a regular basis to get our team very close to customers in an authentic way. We also rolled out something years ago that we still do called the Remitly Scholars Program, which was the insight that a lot of people that work for Remitly have relatives abroad that they can send money to, which is great. But if they may only be able to send to one corridor, or they may not have a relative abroad that they can send to. And so we designed this thing called the Remitly Scholars Program, which basically gives our team members, pairs them with a scholar in the Philippines, where we started it. And it's a university student in the Philippines. And they send money regularly back to a university student in the Philippines. They use our product. We encourage them to use competitors' product to get competitive insights. And there's like a Remitly Scholar Slack channel where we get phenomenal feedback on what we can do better as a company and and what we can do better in our product. That's one of the reasons we do it. The other reason we do it is like it's a great way to give back to the initial like corridor and country that we served. And this was pre-pandemic, obviously, but there was like a Remitly Scholars luncheon where we've had a huge impact on, I don't know the exact number, but a large number of university students in the Philippines. And that's just the right thing to do. It's also how we build a trusted brand and just do the right thing in the long term. So anyway, customer centricity can take different forms depending on where one is at in the journey, but it institutionalizing it and operationalizing it is super, super important. And I think that there are business milestones that are also really important moments to anchor in customers. So obviously we went public last year, and as part of the celebration, we had some of our earliest customers and loyal customers, many of whom I've had a relationship with over the years directly, up there on stage with us, ringing the bell as NASDAQ opened. Also, we had a founder and family dinner. So it was the founders, the family of the founders, and early customer dinner only during our trip to New York right after the IPO. Super meaningful. It was so memorable to like have my family get to know some of our earliest customers, have them get to know my family. And I think that those are moments where it's easy to get caught up in other motives that are only, other motives as opposed to what matters, which is customers and making a positive impact in their lives. And then lastly, I'd say when it comes to customer centricity, there's also one-way door decisions along the way that are important to consider and make. So one-way door decisions, meaning this decision is more definitive. It's harder to go back and reverse that decision. One of the things we did is, still as a private company, was do something called Pledge 1%, which over 10 years gives 1% of the company's value to philanthropic causes that ultimately are in service of accomplishing our vision. And that's something that we did that I think will help be the foundation for things like our ESG, our environmental, social, and governance programs over the years. So it's also being really intentional about the right decisions that need to be made over the years. So those are some, before I open it up back for questions, I think that customer centricity value is always at the top for those reasons. Those are a few ways which we have instilled it. We've made a ton of mistakes. Like the last thing I want to have this talk come across as is like we've done customer centricity perfectly. Oh, we've let so many customers down along the way. We've not fully understood our customers the way that we should. That's the nature of so many businesses. But I think you can't fake customer centricity if you're anchored in that and anchored in it authentically. Then I think that's what drives the long-term success, and having a growth mindset and having all of the decisions of the business come back to what's in the best interest of the long-term best interest of our customers is the right way to ultimately achieve long-term success. So with that, I will open it back up for questions.
Thanks, Matt. Before we go on with questions, personal plug, Jollibee. Get the chicken and the spaghetti. It's gonna be different. So just be prepared, but it's good. I think you just have to have the right mentality for it. So, and peach mango pie. So personal plug before we get back into business. You had mentioned using non-scalable marketing strategies. Tan in the YouTube chat has a question about marketing. Their question is, do you have any recommendations on the marketing part, especially in the beginning? Every company uses a different marketing strategy. and they want to learn what strategy you used and
Yeah.
if you have any recommendations for other startups.
Yeah, definitely. And I love the Jollibee plug, Yuli. I definitely had my share of Jollibee when we were running that specific booth. Delicious.
Yeah.
I think that marketing strategy. So here's the way I think about marketing, and I'm going to talk more to direct to consumer, but the principles probably apply to B2B as well. First, what you've got to do is you've got to figure out if customers want your product. And spending a whole bunch of money on marketing before you understand if customers actually want your product is not generally a good idea, because it's just not going to be efficient. And by want your product, it's like product market fit. Like, are customers buying it? Are they coming back and using it again and again? Focus on that first. If you haven't got product market fit, maybe do a little marketing, but you should be super clear on what the objective is, which is to get enough customers into your product to test and learn the hypotheses you're trying to answer of, like, are customers using this? Once you've got product market fit, then every company has a different approach to marketing. Some, are very brand focused and less measured focused. It's not a bad strategy. Some are more PR focused exclusively. Our strategy, at least in the early days, and it's expanded, was much more like data driven and measured. And so we would market first we'd understand our unit economics, which is a way of quantifying that product market fit. So I spend X dollars to invest in that trust, invest in that customer relationship. That's customer acquisition cost. And then there's Y dollars of gross profit over Z quarters, years, et cetera. And then if you understand how much each individual customer's lifetime value is, then you can match the customer acquisition cost with the lifetime value. That's how we thought about it, is like, let's invest in the trust, let's deliver a great product, and then scale it. But we needed to have channels that we could measure that were more kind of bottom of the funnel. So we used a lot more digital channels and online channels in the early days. And then we've expanded from that to include a wider range of marketing channels. But that's just our approach. I think the data-driven unit economic approach is our approach. The principle that I would be clear on is, are you at product market fit yet or not? If you're not, be clear the goal is not to scale at this point. The goal is to get traffic, to learn. And then once you've got that, depending on what your skills are, what industry you're in, you can be more of a brand marketer, be more of a direct response analytical marketer, or somewhere in between.
Thanks. The answer might be right in front of me, but I guess the question is, it's extremely rare for entrepreneurs to be successful in their first startups. What do you attribute your success to?
Two things, and I say this not to be like humble, but very authentically, is surrounding myself with people that are much better at what they do than I am. Shared values, completely different skills. And in those early days, I brought some unique skills where I was probably the best. Now it's just I've brought in people that I've surrounded myself with people that are much better at what they do than I am. I think that's number one. And I think the second is, I'd say there's two others. The second is having a growth mindset. Like I put together a development plan every year, starting from the very beginning. And part of why I like doing a startup and a growth company is the opportunity to learn, change. My job is so different now. It could not be more different than it was 10 years ago. And I love that. But I think that one has to love and really intentionally invest in growth, in their own growth, because the job will change. And the third is luck. Like, there's a lot of things outside of one's control in a startup that, luck and level-headedness. Things probably aren't. I've probably not been as smart as I thought I was when things were going great, and I probably am not as dumb as I think I am when things have gone really poorly. So that, I think, keeping things in perspective, understanding that some things are luck, especially in the short term, but if you do those other elements that I mentioned, and then again focus on customers in the long term, then there's a lot of luck and bumps along the way.
Remittances are about money, and startups are about money too. It's remarkable how little you talked about money. So if you focus on customers and UX, the business case will take care of itself.
Yep. So what was the second part? It said remittances are about money. What was the second?
Startups are about money too.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. I do think if you focus on the customer, the rest will take care of itself. I also think that remittances are about money, but again, when you go back to the trust element, I used to think it was like, oh, you offer a lower price and like the customers will come. But there is so much heart in remittances that's more than meets the eye. It's like this connection of our customers to their families back home. So I understand it's definitely an element of like we are sending money for sure, but there's that, and but there's a lot more to remittances than meets the eye when as I've gotten closer to our customers. And then startups are about money. I think that certainly there's a return element. We've brought along some investors that are like double bottom line or sustainability investors. So I do think there are investors that genuinely just focus more on the long term. I had one investor that almost didn't invest because he thought I was too mission driven, which was a big compliment. But I think that I think all those things, but then separately, when you said startups are about money, it's a long journey. It's a long journey. And the chances are, if you just look at the highs and lows that any entrepreneur has throughout the journey, maybe this is true. Maybe and maybe somebody can get through some of the lows just thinking about this like big, amount of money that could be made in the future. But I actually think unless there's a higher purpose to what you're doing, then it's really hard to get through the tough times because I think but that could just be my motives, honestly. Like, but there are probably some entrepreneurs that are like, the only motive is to make a bunch of money, and that could be okay too. So I may just be self-projecting, but for me, it's never been about like I would do like early days. It's definitely I do what I do because I really care about our customers and I really want to build a company that's lasting and has a huge impact. And it happens to have also worked out well financially. And maybe that's just me, maybe that's just our business. But I tend to think those are also like some of the most meaningful good businesses out there.
Great. Going back to customer centricity, does customer centricity mean that the customer is always right? And if it doesn't, how do you separate good customers from others?
Mm-hmm. I don't think I think customers are always right about the problem that they have. Like you can't like, and that can't be denied. But I often think customers don't know the solution that they want. So this is a random example. It's kind of nuanced, but yeah, we only have a couple minutes left. But basically, there have been a lot of lessons along the way where we had to test in partnership with our customers, sometimes qualitatively, sometimes quantitatively, what this solution was. And I don't think customers are always right about the solution, but they're always right about their problem. And so trying to get them to like something that they don't like or buy something they don't want to buy. Maybe you can think in the back of your mind of companies that have tried to do that and gotten themselves in trouble. Ultimately, I think companies have to lead when it comes to solutions, but customers are always right about the problems that they're looking for you to solve.
Great. And we'll end with this last question. We have a lot of fledgling and promising entrepreneurs watching the video right now. Do you have any books or resources you would recommend?
Depends where you're at on the startup journey, but I love The Hard Thing About Hard Things by Ben Horowitz. It's a compilation of his blog posts, but it reads as a book. And what I love about it is during those lonely times when things are tough, especially as like earlier stage private companies, you can open it up and there's like, he's been through it and he has some really actionable good advice. So that would be the one that comes to mind.
Great. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you all for joining us today. And a big thank you to Matt for sharing his wisdom with the group. As a reminder, next Friday at noon, we'll be hearing from Jane Park, CEO and founder of Talkie, who will present Failing into Entrepreneurship. Sign up for that. Have a great weekend. Maybe try some Jollibee, and we'll see you next week.